Nate hasn't seen it. He was watching Top Gun.
No. I was just going to say the most
lost Nate
iconic.
a while ago.
Everyone knows that song. I was like, if I was ever a professional baseball player, that would be my walk-up song.
Oh, yeah?
Our goal in this podcast is to know Jesus better, and by the power of his Spirit, do better, so together we can be a little better.
Well, welcome to A Little Better podcast. This is episode AD1 after Daniel. So we are all lamenting, grieving a little bit, but we're doing our best, trying to hold it up here. And so we've got Drew, Nate, and myself. And Nate, you were the one who took it up there, brought it to us this week again. You've handled week 1 and week 3 of our series. We'll wrap it up next week. But as always, how about your sermon in 60?
Sure. This week was really all about just talking about walking alongside people. Kind of week 1 and week 2 have been about like God's view of trials and our response in them. That was last week when Daniel was talking about lamenting. But I pretty much just talked about what do we do when someone around us is hurting? Mm-hmm. What do we do? What do we not do? And we looked at Job's friends, who are often known for what they did bad, but there are some lessons in there that they did right for how we can walk with people and ultimately just practice the blessing and the power of just being present, being with someone in their pain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know if if Job's friends, I was looking at Drew over here for some reason. If Job's friends can hear us, if they're in heaven, I don't know. I'm sure they're very grateful for this sermon. They got many kind words.
This guy's been ripped on for years.
For thousands of years, they've been
they did some bad things, but they started strong.
They always do say it's not how you start, it's how you finish. So,
that's true. It does kind of wipe out your legacy when you go down in flames.
You know, I just thought about this in the spectrum of the sermon series. Right, I feel like this is a good start-off question. Which would you rather do? Suffer or walk with someone who is suffering?
Oh, I mean, for sure, walk with someone.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that feels a little bit, just because suffering's tough.
Yeah.
And it is hard. And it's hard. It's hard to walk with someone, but I guess, that's such a hard thing to gauge. But I guess my initial thought would be, I'd rather walk with someone than rather have to do this suffering my own.
I think it depends on the relationship to who is suffering. Because it's like Ashley and I, we asked this question because we've both been through that person in the hospital. And we would agree that I would rather be in the hospital bed suffering than watching my wife suffer.
Yeah.
But I think, in general, I'd rather walk with someone. But I guess it depends on the relationship.
Yeah. I think we'd all say, our kids, it's a no-brainer,
Yes.
right? If our kids are suffering, we would trade places with them in a heartbeat. But there is an incredible challenge to, that friend who's suffering, and it hurts not to be able, to make a difference, or you feel like you can't make a difference. So, I often ask, as you're preparing the sermon, because I know that, things expand and then they shrink, right? And you've got, 25 minutes, whatever, to, share with us. So I normally ask, what did you leave on the table? I think I'd rather ask, what Top Gun illustrations did you leave on the table? But
boy, how much time do we have? Come on now. Yeah.
But seriously, was there other things that you would have included if you had more time?
Sure. I think what was hard, on the practical side, I think I gave 4. Yeah, I gave 4. When your friend starts to speak, because that's where, I deviated from Job's friend's story. We saw the 3 clear examples that they did well. And I think when I got to that point of what do we do when our friends start to speak? And I gave 4 things. There's so many other things that you could include in that I didn't have necessarily the time to do. So trying to whittle that down. I actually included a bunch of them even in the notes that didn't show up as lower thirds. But there's just so many practical things that are out there that I feel like there was what are good what questions. So I've heard people say if you're listening well and you're asking questions, ask what questions. So I was like, well, maybe I could give a bunch of examples of what, what were you thinking, Brad? No,
so that
sounds harsh.
But what were you thinking? Karen says it all the time. But But to follow up to that would be then also like additional resources. Are there other things that you think are just well worth the time if you want to help a friend?
My dad recommended this book to me, which is great. Side by Side by Ed Welch is like my talk, but way better and way more in depth. That he just talks all about just that ministry of presence and the ministry of just walking with side by side. So that is for sure a great resource if you're looking to dig into that a little bit more. Side by Side by Ed Welch is really good.
Great. Hey, you were talking about, and it was really a real challenge to not be, the answer man when your friend is suffering. But what if you got really, really good advice? I mean, killer advice. I mean, Drew wrestles with us all the time.
Yeah.
He knows what the answer is. What do you do?
Well, I think the truth is your advice is only as good as the person who will receive it. Right? Great advice, if it's not heard, felt, and received, is really not that great of advice. And so I think what makes great advice often is the timing of that advice, is the circumstances of that advice, and if the person is ready to receive that advice.
Right.
And so like you can say some of the greatest things, and if they fall on deaf ears, how great are they really?
Yeah.
So I think part of like what Nate really got after is understanding circumstances. And before you ever give advice, building a relationship and a presence that maybe at some point you can, when someone is ready for that advice, to give it.
Yeah, it reminds me, I shared the story of how for many of us, like 2.5, 3 years ago was really, really tough on all of us for differing reasons. And I mentioned meeting with Ed, and in the midst of that too, Emily and I actually went down to Pennsylvania to meet with a Christian counselor who just specializes in meeting with people who are in ministry, because he was a former pastor, and it was just a really great, honestly, just a uplifting and encouraging time in a really hard time. But his name was Ron, and I remember asking him this question. It was like session 1, and we were talking through things, and I asked him this question. So like, Ron, what would you do, or what would you say? And he took like the longest pause, and he was sitting there and he was thinking like really long, and he just said, Nate, I want to be careful here because I don't want to do the work for you. And then he just kept asking questions. And I thought like that is such a wise response, because so often, at least for me, in my advice, I'm trying to do the work for you. So here's what you need to do. So sometimes we just gotta, to your point, like, is now the right time, or is this the right moment to say, hey, here's what you need to do? But oftentimes, like, we can rob people of the work and journey they need to go on by just trying to slap a Band-Aid on this, and here's 3 things that you can do. So it's so an art, and
that's a fascinating insight, because I often think about, well, I don't want to speak because I'm making assumptions, and you talked about that, like making assumptions, going in the wrong direction. But you could even be going in the right direction, but the timing might not be right. Yeah.
Well, and I think of like, even if you take suffering out of it for a second, have you ever been around that person that just, when you're around them, they ask just really pointed and really good questions that take you on a journey? Like my Southern dad was that guy, right? Like when you sat down with him, it felt like he was just walking you through this journey, and you didn't know where you were going, but all he did was ask you questions, and you felt so loved and comforted and known by him. And he never really said anything other than like, hey, tell me what your dream is. Tell me where you want to be, right? And he just ushered you through these questions, and you felt like, wow, I have so much clarity in my life because you just asked me questions. And I think questions are a really powerful thing.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah, and they are, and I feel like good question askers, you can almost lead and point, if you're asking good questions, to the work that person needs to do, or even the solution that is in front of them. But they're discovering it rather than here it all is and do these 4 things that I feel like is where I want to get to. You're like, because I value that in people that can say through questions are leading me to like, oh, not you're right, but that's right.
Yeah. And that's why I resonated with your, like the whole you and Emily and will like Pastor Nate leave, right? Like I honestly think that's how my wife feels, is like, Drew, you're giving me like a 4-step sermon on how to fix my problem. And that I think that's a great answer to the question. What I'm saying to my wife in that moment is actually true. Good for her.
It's brilliant.
Honey, Brad said that, not me. But it's the timing, right? She is. Yeah. It's not right, and it's not good advice. even though I feel like it's great advice, it's actually horrible advice because it's not ready to be received. And I think that's the beauty of what Nate talked about. Is like the pressure of trying to like perfect the perfect steps to fix somebody is off of us. It's our presence that often leads to that journey.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, I mean, Drew, you talked to express that in pre-preach, just how liberating and freeing this can be. And it frees you to be present, to be compassionate, not to have those, you're elsewhere. Your gears are thinking of the thing to say. You don't need to, be present with that person. But I think it's also, for me, kind of challenging because then it's like now we're talking about an investment of time. Now we're talking about slowing down to the pace of them. And I just have to be honest and say, there's times where I say, I don't have time for that. And that just reveals my dark heart. So for people who do give that gift of presence, it's appreciated.
Well, and I feel guilty because I'll be honest, my mercy card is very low. I'm honestly sometimes, this sounds sad, but I'm like, you should probably just get over that. That's how I feel sometimes. Like, really?
Yeah.
That's not that big of a deal.
Yeah.
And I think there's so many, I feel so guilty of like, I felt so challenged. Like, I just need to be a friend, right? Like, what good friend says, oh, hey, get over it. And it's not the time. It's literally my broken heart.
Yeah. We've been going through this series. We'll do the fourth and final week next week. And I think it sounds to me like most of the suffering we've talked about is stuff that comes, it just happens to us. In Job, this suffering happened to him. He didn't know the reason why, but he knew he was innocent. Now, his friends made assumptions about him being guilty of sin, right? And that wasn't helpful. But what if your friends really are guilty of sin? What if we see these as self-inflicted wounds, that these people are suffering because they're just not listening to good advice. They need the right Bible verses or whatever. I don't know, but we see people make bad choices. Is there any nuance to your advice, when people are sinning?
A lot of it comes to the relationship too. I think I feel like the more frank I'm able to be, it's someone I'm closer with, or I've taken the time to listen well, or have a strong relationship, stronger relationship with. Like that. Yeah. That's where I feel like I can get quicker to like, bro, what were you thinking? And then talk through it from there. So a lot of it, I think, depends on the relationship and obviously the situation. It's kind of hard to just blanket like.
Yeah, that's the hard thing about suffering is each circumstance is different.
Yeah.
And the timing of that circumstance, the relationship of that connection with that person, all those things blended together hopefully can be a guide for you on how to navigate, offer advice, and be present with people. There's no like quick, hey, just do these 3 steps and boo, it's a perfect recipe because every circumstance is different. And there are times where you got to be like, hey, this is hard to hear, but if you keep doing this, you're going to keep being here.
Yeah, right.
But knowing how to navigate those and the relationship you would have with people and the timing of that advice is crucial.
I think that's even a good question to think through. Like I talked about listening well, and I think listening is this a sin issue or a suffering issue? That was another thing on the chopping block that I didn't get to. But as you're listening to your friend or stepping in, like being able to place, is this a sin issue? Like, man, they did make some poor choices here, and I need to like just be aware of that. Or is it a suffering issue and they didn't do anything wrong, but are on the receiving end of someone else's sin or whatever circumstance.
Right. Even suffering is such a blanket thing, right?
Right.
Suffering comes in all shapes and forms. And really, theologically, all suffering is sin related, right? It's the curse of sin on our world.
Sure.
Not a direct cause of personal sin, but just ultimate sin.
Right.
And then there are times where we just make sinful choices that come with consequences. And the consequence is at some level suffering. But I think one of the tensions I felt in this message was just, okay, I agreed with everything, but how long do I suffer with someone? Right? Even just reading your good parts of Job's friends, they sat with him 7 days, and I'm like, what? I'm like, how did they do that? Now, obviously culture, we got to understand culture and what that looks like, but like, what is the longevity of this? When do I know I can let go of somebody suffering, or know I did my part and hand it off to somebody else? Or am I responsible to endure the suffering until it ends? Like, give me some advice on that component of the longevity of walking with somebody who is suffering.
Sure. Again, I don't think there's a perfect answer, but I think there should at least be a commitment to not just the temporary, but to the long haul. Mm-hmm. And I think if you're walking with, again, we're talking about walking with, not walking someone through. So I think to be a good friend also means the pressure isn't on us to fix the situation. So that, again, helps us to be like, I can walk with you longer, because I'm not trying to fix this burden for you. I'm just trying to be a helpful friend and be an encouragement. So I would hope that's a long-term thing, not just a temporary, hey, I popped in, you good, see ya, but that there would be a commitment for this being, for the long haul, whatever that means. Again,
yeah, it's a bit of a team sport too.
Yeah,
right?
oh yeah.
You're, again, we've talked about community group, and it's not just one person responding, but people taking turns, and here's my time, but God's going to bring someone else alongside for My mom, when my dad died, he was 52, and there was years of my mom. There were so many people who came and went in her life that God brought alongside for different periods to grieve with her.
And I think also, like, understanding the response times of suffering. So I remember when my dad died, like, everybody for the first 2 weeks were texting and almost at a point where it was like, this sounds like harsh, but like, I didn't even want it. I wanted to just like be left alone. And one thing that I've learned in grief and suffering is sometimes I will pause my response to fill the gap, because after 2 weeks, it's amazing how fast people move on with their life. And you're still left with this hole, this hurt, this pain. And after 2 weeks, everybody's gone, right? The support system seems to like fade really fast. And learning to navigate and help people like through that period, I think, is a really missing art in how we walk with people. Of like, the initial response is like normal, practical, almost automatic, but like, how do I span that over time? For some people, it was just, hey, I know people, like, it's going to be hard. Whenever you need me, you let me know. Like, I am willing to drop anything, and I will be there for you. And I think sometimes it's not even necessarily like being with somebody for all the time, but it's just them knowing, when you have a moment, when you need me, I will be there.
Sure. That's really good. Which is, I love that, because it really is kind of a missing piece in our fast-paced world today. Of like, man, we're good at the short-term help, but that long-term and commitment, I think, is something I can grow in. I think a lot of us can grow in, of like, how do you be present, not just now, but for the longer term.
And I think great steps in this journey is like reminders in your phone, right? Like, someone who's suffering, set a reminder per, like, one per week. Like, hey, text whoever, are you good? And have that reminder come up once a week. And as they navigate it, move it to every 2. You know what amazed me when I got back from Israel? So it was the first time I was back to Israel when I got the phone call that my dad died. So it was like, I felt like it was the last part, hill to conquer in my grief with my dad's loss. I was amazed at how many people texted me, hey, are you okay? How did the trip go?
That's cool.
And I was just like, it's been 3 years.
Yeah.
And here is a great example of someone still walking with me through that
awesome.
suffering.
Yeah, that's such a great point. It's years.
Yeah.
Years to walk through that. Wow, incredible. So, are our wives better at this than we are? I mean, and we do a little poll here. I mean, I know that my wife is not a word person. I think she has incredible words, because when she speaks, I think they're incredible. It's incredibly wise, but she's very tentative about that, and she's never going to be like a public speaker and that. But she I feel that she can be so present with people, and she herself, cancer survivor, and then so that's probably another piece of it too. Is if there's similarities in our suffering, with someone else. I mean, I'm sure there's other people who lost their dads who came and talked to you.
Oh yeah.
There's but and can be powerfully present. But I know that my wife, she's better at the presence. I speak way too much.
100% agree. Yeah. My Emma is more introspective, introvert, and takes time to really reflect and think. And so when she comes to really bring something, I've learned, and I don't always do this great, but like to really appreciate that and really listen and seek to understand, not go anywhere else, but just to kind of keep that spotlight on her. But she's a way better listener than I am. Yeah.
So Ashley's a way better listener than I am too. I'm not a fill the silence person. I actually have like a gauge of like one of my gauges for a really close friendship is that I can be with that person and we can sit in a room and not talk. Right? Like be with each other and like be comfortable enough to not like, oh, hey, what do we have to talk about right now? Like just, hey, we are such good friends that like our company is enough.
I'm laughing because I remember a best man speech once where the guy said, I can sit with Dan for hours and not say a thing. Yeah. I thought that was the greatest praise.
Oh, I just think we've lost the power of silence. Like we try to fill and silence is awkward to us.
Right. Yeah, and we're not good with boredom, and we're keeping ourselves stimulated all the time. Yeah. So you think about the times when I'm distracted by my own phone when I'm with someone. Yep. It just, and it drives me nuts when I want somebody to be present with me and that dinging is going off. But, it's hard.
Yeah. And every time you look at your phone, and my wife will tell me this, it's like I'm showing more value to my phone than the person right in front of me. It's like a good pet peeve of like, if you're present with someone, be present. Don't look at the phone. Wait until that conversation is over. If you want to like devalue someone, while they're talking, look at your phone. Yeah. It's just to say like, I see you, but I really don't see you or value.
Yeah, that's a great question. Are we more present with our phones than we are with people?
Yeah, they certainly seem to have a higher priority. They can cut through anyone. Yeah, that's bad. All right, so, and feel free to repeat yourself, but just insight that you feel you'd love people to walk away with.
Really just the power of presence and helping people understand, like, when you see someone hurting, we jump to solutions, right? We jump to, like, how can I fix this? But truly the greatest gift I think you can give someone is just to be with them, that they don't feel alone, that you're walking with them and you're there for them. Practice the power of presence. Yeah, just the simplicity of that.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add to that. That's what God gave us too, is his presence.
Yeah.
And how powerful of a thing it is in my life and my suffering to know God is with me every step of the way. And just like Nate said, the power of your presence is enough.
Yeah, Nate, I appreciate your message so much. I found it very helpful and incredibly challenging. Like I said, I think the darkness of my heart is, do I really have the patience, the compassion, the desire to be present with that person? And I know, and I was thinking, well, how do I get more compassion? And it just seems to me that it's the same way we get more patience. It's through our own suffering. So God using suffering in my life to make me a better friend to others.
Yep.
Well, listen, hey, thanks for joining us. Come back later for the final week, the fourth week of When Life Hits Hard.